Hello there, my name's Vince, I'm a composer, and in this video I'll be attempting to answer the question, what makes a great melody? And I'll be doing that by analysing three of my favourite melodies in the classical orchestral tradition. So first of all, let me try and define my terms. So there are two ways that I like to define melody. The first is simply, if I were to ask you, how does that song go again? The bit that you'd hum back to me, that's the melody. And I like to contrast that with the more supporting accompanying instruments. And then the second way that I like to talk about melody is to say the melody is kind of like the hero in our story. It's kind of the protagonist. It's Frodo in Lord of the Rings. It's Harry Potter. And so it's not so much that the other instruments aren't important, but they're just more part of the world. They're part of what's happening. They're a kind of supporting cast. And the story wouldn't be the story without them, but there's a focal point, and that focal point is the melody.
I will take the ring to Mordor.
Now, of course, not all music has or requires a melody. There's lots of styles of music which are more about groove or more about texture. But you're watching this video, so I'm assuming you're interested in how to write great melodies. So I've defined what I mean by melody. Now, what do I mean by great? So for the purposes of this video, all I mean by great is something that's more like the sound that you want to produce, the sound that's in your head, the music that's trying to come out of your soul. And you could also say it's more like the music that your favourite artists play. So how can we write melodies that are more like the melodies that we want to produce? I propose that, quite simply, the best way to improve in writing melodies is to find music that you enjoy and to study it and to listen with an analytical ear and to try and glean insights from it, using whatever music theory knowledge you have at your disposal. Don't worry about understanding it perfectly, just try and glean one little insight, and you'll find that those are the insights which really stick around and which will end up showing up in your own work quite organically. So here we are in Logic. I've got my first piece loaded up here. I'll just play it through, and you can follow along with the MIDI as well as I play. And in a moment we're going to go through these points above my head, which are some of the kind of angles that I'll be using, some of the framings or lenses that I'll be using for our analysis. But first, let's just listen. Absolutely beautiful. This is one of my favourite moments in all of music. Yeah, I know it's a little corny, but it's just a fantastic melody. And a little echo at the end there. And again. So of course that was the New World Symphony by Dvořák. Just a little excerpt there. That's not the whole piece. There's a whole symphony as well, but that's one of the main melodic themes, and I think a really great example of just a fantastic melody to me, very clearly stated on a single instrument, which is a great arranging technique to just present a melody with one instrument chosen specifically for that context. So it makes it extra focused, and a bit like how I was saying before about the melody being our hero of the story. You really feel that when it's a soloist. You really feel like you're rooting for that soloist. I feel that kind of emotional bond. Anyway, so up above me I've got some of these different dimensions of melody that I want to talk about. So the first one is question and answer. So I'll just talk a little bit over this piece of music as we go. So our first phrase, we have our opening statement. It's kind of in two parts, and then we have our second phrase. So I would say this first sentence, for me, ends in a question. It's unresolved. And then this second phrase da 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 has a resolution. So we've got question answer there. Then we go away to our sort of B section. And the whole vibe of this B section feels a little bit ambiguous. So to me, that I consider that whole section as a kind of question, which at the end of it is resolved again. So then we get our repetition of the theme, just as it was before, but the slight alteration is it has a bigger ending to it. So it's kind of like an ultimate answer at the end, or a real kind of sense of confidence in your answer at the end. So that's the first dimension of melody, is this kind of interplay between question and answer. Then I wanted to talk about harmony. Specifically, how does the melody relate to the underlying chord? And is that creating tension? In which case, those are some spicy notes. Or is it quite an easygoing relationship? In which case, those are some quite mild notes. And so, as I'm sure you can probably get just from the overall vibe and how the piece kind of hits you, generally the notes are very consonant with the chords. So if we just quickly look at the first phrase, we have a D-flat chord, and our first melody note is an F, which exists within the D-flat chord. Da, 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 da. So all of the kind of emphasized notes there are within the D-flat major chord. And then similarly, when we go to our next chord, which is a kind of A flat over a D flat pedal, da, 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 da. So that's, again, it just is a chord tone that we're hearing. So there's really not very much tension there in terms of how the melody is sitting against the chord. There are a few passing notes, but all of those passing notes kind of sit happily within the associated scale of that chord. And another way of thinking about it is all of the notes in this melody come from this pentatonic scale, which is the D-flat major pentatonic. So that's the kind of overall mode that the piece is in, and it doesn't stray outside of that mode. It doesn't start to bring in notes that are alien to that scale, like for example this note or this note or that note. It stays within this set of notes. So we have da 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 da. It's all kind of within that set of notes. So that's another way in which this is a very consonant melody. There's only one moment which is a little bit more spicy, and that's when it goes to the C natural here in the second section of the piece, that particularly juicy moment. Hear that. It's one of the most beautiful moments, and for anybody interested in that sort of thing, it's using a kind of Lydian flavour there over the 4 chord, which creates a real moment of tension. But it's just a moment, and it's interesting how even just that one little bit of spice in an otherwise very kind of homey piece kind of makes all the difference. It really elevates the whole. So next I wanted to talk about straight versus syncopated. And you could think of this as the rhythm equivalent of what we were just talking about with harmony. This is how much tension is being created by things going off the rhythmic grid and creating a kind of rub against the natural kind of metronome of the piece, the natural pulse of the piece. And here, once again, we can confidently say that most of the melodic notes kind of land very easily within the rhythmic feel of the piece. There is a slight lilt, this kind of da 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 kind of. So some of these little in-between notes are creating a little bit of energy, a little bit of, not tension exactly, but a little bit of seasoning, if you will. And that's part of what gives the piece its charm. It's part of what gives it its kind of slightly folky lilt. But on the whole, all of the main notes of the melody are landing on the important beats of the bar. And so it's quite sort of safe and at home on that grid there. Next, we've got spacious versus dense, and this is split into two parts, vertical and horizontal. So vertical spaciousness is all about the intervals. Are the pitches quite far apart from each other, creating this kind of quite wide open space, or are they all quite compressed and kind of more linear, perhaps in fashion, where all the notes are kind of quite close next to each other? Let's just have a quick look at the notes here. So as you can see, they're relatively close to each other. There are no notes that are like sticking way out here and way down here, for example. So in that sense, they're quite densely packed. But also, for me, the fact that the melody is based around a pentatonic scale creates a little bit of vertical spaciousness, because in the pentatonic scale there is just that little bit of extra space between the notes compared to a normal linear diatonic scale like that, or even a chromatic scale where everything's really bunched up. In a pentatonic scale you have this natural space between the pitches of the notes, so as opposed to, which would be kind of like the scale version. Moving on, we have the horizontal dimension of spaciousness, or density if you like. And here we're talking about the rhythmic values and how often are the notes changing. So what I've done here is taken the rhythm of the piece and just put it on a bongo, so you can listen to nothing but the rhythm. So let's have a listen to that now. So you can even just see how much space there is here. This is kind of like a graph. So huge space there between the phrases, and even within the phrases themselves there's lots of gaps. So I would say there's a lot of horizontal space there, and that's part of what gives it this really open, relaxed feeling. Next, I have this curious dimension that I'm calling adventure / stay at home. I still can't quite find the right words for this one, but it's something to do with the shape or the journey or the narrative structure. So again, if we look at the MIDI notes here, I would say the overall kind of story of this piece for me is you start here, you go away, and then you come back again, but you return with a little bit more of an extra something. That's the kind of basic story of the piece. It's something like a hero's journey. So you have this kind of overall arc, and it even exists as a kind of pitch arc as well. You can kind of see a sort of shape there, and this sort of extra surge at the end. So there is, for me, a comprehensible pattern or shape going on there. And then if we zoom in a little bit to this level, we can also see a kind of ebb and flow, a kind of similar oscillation happening at this kind of level. So, you know, just a few things to kind of take note of and be aware of, this kind of element of directionality in pieces of music. Finally, is the melody that we're listening to quite plain, or is it ornamented? So let's just have another quick listen. So there's something quite pretty about these little in-between notes. They're almost like grace notes. It's almost like the player is just kind of ornamenting a more basic underlying melody by adding these little extra notes. Certainly this repetition here, da da da, it could just as easily have been ba 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 da da da, but instead it's ba da 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 da. So yeah, it's subtly ornamented. And finally we have this dimension of predictability versus surprise. And again, we can think about this at different levels. Overall, at the most kind of zoomed out level, I'd say this is quite a conventional sounding piece. It's quite a kind of homey sounding piece. There's not a huge amount that kind of surprises you. Then at a slightly more zoomed in level, you could say that this contrasting section in the middle sort of contains a moment of surprise when we step out of our home key and into the subdominant key. And in particular, that note that I mentioned earlier, the sort of tasty note, the C natural, is a moment of surprise as well. In a way, the predictability of the rest of the material is a kind of prerequisite for the impact of that little moment with the C natural. So these things very much work in tandem with one another. Okay, let's move on to the next musical example. I'm sure you'll be familiar with this one. Cool, and I'm fading it out there. Yeah, awesome. Love that piece of music. Really cool, and quite interesting to just look at the melody in this case. I found when I was preparing for this, a few surprises in there, because it's a very intense and dramatic piece of music, and yet melodically it's relatively constrained, which is quite interesting. So let's get into it. So in terms of this kind of question and answer, tension release, sort of general point about the structure of the piece, this is quite an interesting case. Here we have a piece of music that's characterized by some very clear sort of musical statements here, and at each of these cadential points, each of these kind of end of sentence moments, for me there's a very strong sense of resolution. In fact, if anything, the resolution gets stronger and stronger as we go. So as opposed to the first piece where we had this kind of question answer format, here we have something like answer, answer, yes, 1,000 times yes, answer, kind of increasing sense of confidence. And you can even see in the overall shape of the piece, that's another thing that's kind of following the same pattern there. It's just this increasing sense of confidence in the way that the thing just kind of crescendos and moves up in terms of pitch as well. So let's have a quick listen, focusing on the end of each phrase. Da, 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 da. Feels very resolved there. And then we've got a bit of time to let it sink in. Then another phrase. You know, it feels like we've landed there. And similarly here. It feels like we've landed there as well. So, you know, we have this chord, this chord. You know, so that's the kind of overall trajectory that we're on. It's kind of doing one thing, which I like. Consonance and dissonance. So, despite the fact that this is a very stormy, dramatic piece of music, in terms of the relationship between the pitches in the melody and the underlying chords, there's basically no dissonance whatsoever. And in fact, the melody simply is outlining the chords in a kind of arpeggio or a fanfare. So the entire melody simply consists of playing chord tones. So in the opening we've got... We're in B minor. We're just outlining F sharp, B and D there. You know, and then it goes to D major. So that's literally happening throughout the entire piece. So the tension or the drama isn't coming from the consonance or dissonance of the melody. That's just the thing to kind of point out there. It's coming from somewhere else. In fact, it's coming from more like the chord choices. And in particular, there's some quite spicy moves happening, for example, around here. You've got this happening in the melody because you've got happening in the chords, and the melody just kind of goes with the chords. So here's an example where it's quite hard to kind of pull apart the melody and the harmony because they just kind of go with one another. So, you know, despite the fact that I've chosen this as an example of a great melody, you might say that the melody is almost non-existent because this is more like just a series of chords. But I guess the reason I included it here was because it's still incredibly hummable and singable, and everybody knows that top line. But you know, it's very iconic, even though it's quite generic in terms of it's just an arpeggio going there. Let's look at our third point. So straight versus syncopated. What's going on with the level of rhythmic tension here? I would say this one is even more on the grid than the previous example, which had a little bit of rubato. This one's very driving, and it's really emphasizing those downbeats. Da 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 da. There's our pulse, you know. Ba 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 bang bang bang. You know, it's all about that. If we kind of look at those individual rhythmic groupings, those little cells of material, da 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 da. Within that little box, we've got some kind of rhythmic complication, which is syncopation. We've got that little bit of extra information in there, and to me, emotionally, that sort of extra complexity, I don't know, it's kind of like a little bit of a flex maybe, or it's like something about militaristic levels of control, or there's something kind of quite strong happening, having that sort of little engine inside each of those boxes of material. So overall, I would say it's very on the downbeats, but then kind of at this kind of sub-level, you have some syncopation going on. It's just creating a bit of energy. So that's kind of what's going on there for me. In terms of now spaciousness or density, vertically and horizontally, as we talked about before. So vertically, we have a lot of space because we're using arpeggios, which inherently have a lot of space. You know, there's all this space between the first two notes. You know, so it's a very spacious melody, which I think is part of what makes it feel really epic. You know, it's describing a large area with the melody. It's got this huge kind of territory that it's covering. And then in terms of the horizontal space, let's listen to the famous bongo version of this piece of music, which I've prepared. So we've already talked about how that's quite rhythmically intense there. And then we just have this huge pause. And then the engine kind of starts up again. It's very dense for a period of time, and then it's loads of space, and then it's very dense, and then there's loads of space. And you can kind of see that here. Going to the adventure/stay-at-home element. So, I mean, very simply, we already talked about before, this has got a very clear narrative structure. The narrative structure is yes. The narrative structure is up the mountain. That's the narrative structure. It's not stay at home. It's very much into the enemy's territory or something. Plain versus ornamented, very easy. There's no ornamentation here whatsoever. It's very straight to the point. Just chord tones, that's it. No passing notes, no fluff, no BS, no suspensions, no floating around. It's just... And then the final dimension, predictability versus surprise. So just focusing on the melody, I would say that the melody is following a sequence. There's a kind of recognizable pattern. It's repeating a lot of material, and so in that sense, it's quite predictable. There is one small tweak to the pattern which I'd like to mention, and that is when we hit this section over here, we get some variation, not only in kind of the just overall structure of the melody, but the fact that here we have this little stepwise motion. Whereas every other time we've heard something like this, you know, just playing on the chord tones, you know, whereas this time we get that little bit of stepwise motion in there, and to me that just kind of tweaks my ear just a little bit and kind of keeps me from feeling like I know it all, feeling like I can predict everything that's coming up. And then finally, here's the last piece of great melodic writing that I want to share with you in this video. So a repeat of the first musical phrase, and then a kind of variation on this earlier section. But as you can see visually, it's very much a question-answer kind of thing again. Then we've got our contrasting B section. Kind of like the New World Symphony, this all feels like a bit of a departure in this section, so kind of functions as a question. And a very elongated question there. Beautiful counterlines in the cello. Love that harmonic shift. I'm just going to let this one play out, I think, to the end. Love that. Again, wonderfully clear melody. Just very no nonsense. A very clear kind of protagonist to that piece. You know, it's lyrical, it's beautiful, it's uncluttered. It's very simple, but it's interesting at the same time. And of course, there are those lovely little touches in the underlying arrangement with little counter melodies and just complexifications of the harmony and things that kind of just shift it around, so you're not quite sure what's going to happen next. Beautiful piece of music. That's called Pavane by Fauré. So I've already talked about question and answer, so I'll move on to the spicy notes. And this is a piece of music where a lot of the interest is in those slightly more spicy or quirky note choices. This interesting and strange atmosphere that's generated by this kind of continual teasing that happens because of these harmonic suspensions in the melody. So there are kind of too many to point out in this short video. Maybe I'll do a longer video about this at some point, but I'll just point out a few right at the beginning so you can see how they're really embedded from the very start into the core melody of the piece. Suspensions, that is. So let's have a listen. So let's just take that first phrase. So the underlying progression is F sharp minor, D, and then E and C sharp minor, I think. Great chord progression. So we've got, this is a chord tone, F sharp in the melody. Another chord tone, D, but then we get this A against the E major. All of that happening over an E major chord. So there's a lot of dissonance there, and it's leading us to this target note, which is the fifth of the C sharp minor chord there. So that sort of thing is happening just throughout all the time. I'll just pull out one more example, just because the music itself seems to draw a lot of attention to it. And that's in this B section, so I'll just play a little bit of a run into it. So you hear that bit where it kind of repeats and it kind of goes between this note. Just listen again. So each time it's going up to that moment, that note there is a suspension. It's kind of leaning into it and pulling away, leaning into it, and it's really kind of playing with that ambiguity there in a very sort of intentional manner and sort of building it right into the piece. Sometimes you get dissonance that kind of feels like a bit ornamental, whereas this is really invited into the very heart of the melody. So if you like, I really recommend spending some time learning this piece and kind of really analysing the harmony of the melody. It's so interesting, but I think those are the only two examples I'll point out just for the purposes of this video. So next we have the straight and syncopated element. So again, a bit like with New World Symphony, this piece has a slight lilt to it. It's not terribly syncopated. On the whole, it's pretty much quite predictable rhythmically, so there isn't a lot of rhythmic tension in the way that there is harmonic tension. However, there is a little bit of spice in there in the form of some triplets that happen in this B section. That da-da-da against the 4, so 1, 2, 3, 4, da-da-da-da-da-da. That da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da is that's the rub there between those two rhythmic things going on at once, adding a little bit of seasoning there. And then we move on to the issue of space. So vertically, is this spacious piece vertically? I would say no. In this case, we're actually building a melody more out of a scale. So in the first example, we were using the pentatonic scale to build our melody, which had some inherent space to it. In this one, we're using more of a diatonic scale. So here we have, that's our first phrase, and it's kind of built around this scale. So it's all the notes are quite close together. And it's doing that sort of thing, which is quite dense in terms of the vertical dimension. And then in terms of the horizontal dimension, let's have a quick look at our bongo performance. So immediate impression is it's fairly spacious. You've got a few quite big gaps here. And when it's going on, it's not as intense as, say, the Wagner. But it's still got a bit more going on than the New World Symphony, which sounded like this. Flight of the Valkyries again, or Ride of the Valkyries. That's quite intense when it is going on, whereas this is, you know, somewhere in the middle, I would say. Now, what about the sort of narrative aspect, this kind of adventure aspect? I'd say there's definitely a similarity in terms of the overall narrative arc to the New World Symphony, our first example, in that we start off with a certain idea, then we travel somewhere else, then we come back, and it kind of emphasizes the ending by having a couple of repetitions. So that's similar. But I would say that overall, it has, to me, more of a feeling of just kind of staying in one spot and vibing, and there's a lot of repetition going on in terms of these shapes, these little arcs. I would say it's quite consistent, you know, and that kind of shape is continued here, although it's a bit compressed, slightly varied. So I would say, you know, overall, to me, this feels like a piece that's just kind of hanging out in this one vibe. You know, this is a little bit of a subjective interpretation, I guess. But if we zoom in at a bit at the micro level, we can definitely see that, like, these arc kind of patterns, you could say that these are like little mini narrative arcs or little mini shapes. So there's some kind of going away and coming back again at that level. So now what about plain versus ornamented? You know, I would say, again, there's some subtle ornamentation, like these little da-da-da, you know, that are almost acting like grace notes. But for the most part, I'd say it's pretty unadorned. I guess you could say that those little suspension moments da-da-dee-do-da are themselves little ornaments. So the simplified melody might be something like, and instead we get, But I don't know, because of the tempo of it, it doesn't really feel like an ornament to me so much. So I would say this is quite a simple and unadorned, quite elegant melody for me. Finally, the level of predictability and surprise. Well, I would say, just focusing on the melody, it's very repetitive, it follows a pattern. There's some slight moving away in the B section once again, perhaps the way in which you don't get a break between phrases in this B section. So let's just listen to the B section again. And then it's straight into the next phrase, which feels a little bit jarring compared to where previously we've had these little gaps in between the phrases, kind of one statement at a time. The last phrase does repeat several times, so I guess you could call that a kind of a bit of extra variety there, or a bit of extra surprise there at the end, by extending it out in that way. But it's a fairly conventional thing to do, you know. So overall, I would say that this piece definitely lands in quite a conventional space. For me, its beauty doesn't come from the fact that it's kind of pushing a lot of envelopes, and I think that's probably one of the things that these three pieces have in common, is that they, for me, are quite traditional, and yet there's something about them which has a particularity and a particular character and kind of some specificity to it. So it doesn't sound generic to me, even though they follow quite a lot of the conventional rules, you know. I think as a composer, the temptation when writing melodies is to overcomplicate things in order to make things kind of interesting or to grab the listener's attention. And I think it's a real skill that I see in these three works. This kind of balance of creating melodies that are so simple and singable and easy, and yet there's something about how they work and how the rest of the piece is working that means that they endure and they just continue to be loved by people even to this day. So that concludes my little deep dive into these three pieces. Once again, I'm not saying that this is how your music should sound, but rather just showing you how I use these different dimensions of melody to kind of notice a bit what's going on. And you know, of course, when I'm composing, all of this stuff kind of goes away, and I just write whatever sounds are in my head. But I think this process is really valuable, specifically doing it with pieces of music that you're really passionate about. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks very much for watching, thanks for making it to the end, and I'll see you on the next video.